Bon matin, collègues, à cette réunion.
Welcome to this meeting, which is going to be dealing with the emissions reduction strategy of the government. But before we begin, I would like to mention a few housekeeping items. First of all, you've received a draft budget for the briefing sessions on the emissions reduction policies. So if I have your approval, I'll be able to sign off on the budget and we'll be able to move forward with the study. Is that okay? Nobody is objecting to the budget? Thank you. Then secondly, for the pre-study on the Bill C-73, we had reminded you to send in names of potential witnesses. And so far, we've only received one name, unless I'm mistaken. Clerk, yes. So this is a friendly reminder to send in your witness suggestions. Then, thirdly, third housekeeping item. Now, before the break for the holidays, we'll have to give some guidelines to analysts to guide them in drafting the report on sustainable finance. We'll be discussing that in person, but in the meantime, and in order to have some reassurance in case for some reason or other we don't have time to discuss this in the committee in person, please send in your ideas as soon as possible to the clerk and the analysts. That would be very helpful for the analysts if you send this in to the clerk. Send in your ideas so that can be reflected in the report on sustainable finance. And then another point for the 4th of December now. Unfortunately, the Minister of Environment cannot be with us. He's unavailable. So there are various options. This Wednesday, therefore, instead of looking at the supplementary estimates, instead of that, as I've said, would you like to hold the meeting on the Net Zero Accelerator Fund, which was meant to take place on December the 16th? But given that we've got an opening for the 4th, would you so agree to bring forward that date for that meeting? No objections anywhere around the room. So that's done. That's done and dusted. That's decided.
Everybody's available. Yeah, so it's we can slot that in for the 4th. And without further ado, we have with us the pleasure of having with us our Canadian Ambassador for Climate Change, Ms. Catherine Stewart. And we have an hour with Ms. Stewart, which will begin with her opening statements. Ms. Stewart, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the opportunity to appear before this committee today. I'm very pleased to be joined by colleagues from the Department of Environment and Climate Change Canada. I'd like to begin by speaking about my role to help frame this discussion. In August 2022, I was appointed by the Prime Minister to represent Canada as Climate Change Ambassador. I'm one of 6 climate envoys in the G7. In addition, many of our like-minded partners have appointed climate change ambassadors, including Denmark, the European Union, Republic of Korea. I work internationally to advance and defend our interests on climate change and to provide advice to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change and the Minister of Foreign Affairs. I speak about the devastating impacts of climate change, demonstrating that Canada is not immune to its devastating impacts, including on health and security, but also the economic costs associated with extreme weather events, natural disasters, and rising temperatures. I also speak about the significant investments and work that Canada is doing to address climate change and the economic opportunities that accompany a clean growth agenda. To advance my mandate, I work in collaboration with several government departments, but most notably ECCC, Global Affairs, and our embassies and representatives abroad. When it comes to reducing GHG emissions, my message is clear. Canada is taking action at home and has many solutions to offer. I'd like to give you some examples of the activities that I undertake. I'm a champion of the Global Methane Pledge, which is an initiative launched by the US and the EU with the goal of reducing global methane emissions by 30% by 2030. As champion, I look for key opportunities to highlight Canada's leadership in methane reduction. I promote the federal government's strategy, and I point to the significant expertise we have on offer, including companies that specialize in methane detection and reduction technologies. I continue to advocate for coal phase-out in the energy sector, sharing Canada's experience in a just transition, including through the Powering Past Coal Alliance. I've been tasked in developing and advancing the Global Carbon Pricing Challenge, which was launched by the Prime Minister in 2021. Due to my efforts, there are now 18 countries, including the EU, who have joined this initiative. When it comes to those hard-to-abate sectors, Canada co-chairs the Cement and Concrete Breakthrough Initiative, which brings governments and the private sector together to accelerate investments in decarbonization, given the demand for cleaner solutions. And on several occasions, I've represented Canada to highlight how these partnerships are helping to advance critical abatement technology. Canada
also has a strong stake in the clean energy transition that is currently underway. We have strategies in place, including on carbon management, hydrogen, and critical minerals, to seize the economic opportunities that are out there as countries move towards cleaner energy solutions and greater energy security. Again, I look for opportunities to plant our Canadian flag, and so that we're invited to high-level international conversations on these important topics. From my experience, I've seen that there is a genuine interest in hearing what Canada is doing to address climate change. And it's not just about what we're doing, it's also about how we're actually doing this. How are we working across society with provinces and territories, Indigenous peoples, in developing and implementing our climate change plans?
Helps us to push on greater ambition internationally. At the UN climate conferences, or climate COPs, the momentum we achieve throughout the year plays out in key multilateral setting. So much so that at COP28 in Dubai last year, over 190 countries were able to agree to key mitigation commitments to inform our next climate targets and plans, including methane reduction, coal phase down, and the transition away from fossil fuels in the energy sector. On the topic of climate COPs, I have just returned from Baku, Azerbaijan at COP29, where I served as head of delegation for Canada when the minister was not able to be there. Among my activities, I played a key role in helping to conclude difficult climate negotiations, including establishing a new collective goal for developing countries of $300 billion per year by 2035. Climate finance to support developing countries continues to be a key part of Canada's approach to addressing climate change. In my role, I highlight our priority areas of focus and the initiatives we are advancing with our current contribution of $5.3 billion over 5 years. Since 2017, Canada's climate finance reduced or avoided over 230 megatons of GHG emissions and provided 10.5 million people with increased resilience to climate change. Our climate finance helps to build trust among nations as we work together to tackle this global challenge. No one country can address climate change on his own. That's why, in my role, I seek to build partnerships and opportunities for cooperation. I help to advance Canadian solutions and underscore the economic opportunities that can be derived from climate action and green transitions. This work is not easy, but it's critical in order to drive global action while demonstrating Canadian innovation and leadership. I'm now available to take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Stewart. We'll start with Mr. Mazier for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Ambassador, and others for attending here today. Ms. Stewart, according to the Climate Change Performance Index that was released during COP29, Canada now ranks 62nd out of 67 countries in the environmental performance. Given that your mandate includes representing Canada internationally, do you take responsibility for this ranking?
Thank you very much for your question. One of the main reasons that is important for me to engage internationally is so that countries can respect where we're coming from. You know, unlike peer countries, Canada's emissions were on a steady upward climb before we introduced the 2016 Pan-Canadian Framework. And it's important to note what we've been doing to reduce those emissions. And so by talking about...
Ambassador, the question was pretty straightforward. Do you take any responsibility for the ranking? The Canada is now 62nd out of 67 countries. Just a yes or no. Do you take any responsibility?
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Oh, yes.
A little bit of respect and decorum for our nonpartisan officials would be appreciated.
Noted. Mr. Mazier?
Just a yes or no. Do you take any responsibility for this ranking?
I take responsibility for explaining what Canada is doing on climate change internationally.
Thank you. Ms. Stewart, according to Minister Guilbeault's department, your work includes, quote, advancing the Prime Minister's global pricing outreach, end quote. When you visit countries around the world, do you ever encourage them to implement a carbon tax on their own? Yes or no?
One of my responsibilities is to advance an initiative called the Global Carbon Pricing Challenge. And we now have 18 members, 18 countries that have signed up to this challenge, recognizing the value of carbon pricing as a policy tool to help reduce emissions. And just this past COP29, we welcomed 3 more members to the table, including Uruguay, Finland, and Nigeria.
Again, Ambassador, do you encourage countries to implement a carbon tax? Just a yes or no answer.
I am promoting something called the Global Carbon Pricing Challenge to illustrate the value of carbon pricing as one of the important tools that Canada is using to help reduce emissions. And I'm very pleased to see that more and more members have been joining this initiative at the leader level, including the EU, France, Uruguay, Finland, to also help advance carbon pricing.
Ambassador, can you explain?
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Yes, point of order, Mr. Van Koeverden.
I hope that we can encourage members to be kind and courteous to our witnesses who have taken time out of their busy schedules to be here and share their insights with us today.
I agree, and we'll keep in mind that the ambassador is not an elected political figure, so maybe that should be taken into account. Go ahead, Mr. Mazier.
So I guess where we're at with the conversation, I just asked, do you promote and encourage countries to implement a carbon tax? And I think you did refer to the carbon pricing, carbon tax. We know it as a carbon tax here in Canada. That is our system. So you do promote that.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Yes, Mr. Van Koeverden.
As the member opposite knows, the Supreme Court has already said that our carbon pricing is not a tax. He knows that very well.
That's true, but it's not a point of order. It's a point of information or debate. Go ahead, Mr. Mason.
Actually, I believe I was just asking Ms. Stewart to confirm that she does promote the carbon tax to other countries.
I would say there is a genuine interest internationally in the Global Carbon Pricing Challenge. And there are now 18 members that have signed up because they see carbon pricing as a valuable policy tool to reduce emissions.
I have another question here for you. According to reports, you charged Canadian taxpayers $254,000 in travel expenses in less than 2 years on the job. During your travel, did you ever promote or discuss Canada's carbon tax? Yes or no?
So I was appointed climate change ambassador for Canada to engage internationally. And I do take my responsibilities
Ambassador?
very
Do what?
seriously when
What
it
did you do?
comes to traveling. I am
Point
there.
of order, Mr.
Excuse me,
Chair.
Mr. Mazer, I think we need to give Ms. Stewart a chance to respond, but I don't see why this is personally on neither side, why this is so complicated. I mean, the ambassador's role is to promote our approach to battling, fighting climate change, and that would probably, I would imagine, the ambassador promotes all the policies that we have, including capping methane emissions. But I don't know, is it, were you still answering, Ms. Stewart, or?
That's right, Mr. Chair. I promote all of the policies that Canada is implementing and all of the incentives that we've been promoting in order to help address climate change.
All of the policies, including the carbon tax. Thank you. When was the last time you traveled to Canada in your role as Canada's climate change ambassador?
I was in Canada in September.
Where is your main office located?
I am based in Switzerland.
Media reports you were in Paris and London for, quote, carbon pricing outreach. During those trips, you charged Canadian taxpayers over $400 a night in hotels. What is carbon pricing outreach?
As I mentioned, my role as climate ambassador is to talk about what Canada does to address climate change, including promoting the Global Carbon Pricing Challenge. And to give some assurance to this committee of the seriousness I take of travel, I would like to turn to our CFO, who is at the table, our Chief Financial Officer,
that's okay. I
who
have
can
one more
talk
question
about
for you, actually.
the rigor I go through in order to determine my travel.
Okay, well, we're going to have to stop there because the 6 minutes is up. Mr. Van Koeverden.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much to our ambassador for being here today. I apologize for what you've already had to endure, and I hope that the conduct of members on this committee can have a little bit more decorum when addressing you. The work that you do is important and valuable, and I, for one, thank you for what you're doing to address climate change on the global scale. You know, we'll hear often that climate change is something that Canada can't solve on our own, and we know that. We know that we need to work with our partner countries. Canada's a small country. Our emissions are outsized with respect to our population, but they're certainly significant, and we're an oil-producing nation, so we have a strong leadership role to play. And I thank you for playing that leadership role on a world stage. We know that there's massive business opportunities on the global scale for Canada and also for foreign direct investment into our country. Can you talk to us about some of your office's work with respect to Canadian businesses operating in other countries? And also, I'd love a little bit of perspective or insight on those 17 member countries that you've helped to recruit to the effort to lower emissions. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about the 3 that you recently recruited at the most recent COP. And Ambassador Stewart, from our side, thank you again for your extraordinary work and efforts.
Thank you very much to the honourable member for the question. Definitely to your first point, because we are an oil and gas producing nation, it's important to be out engaging in the world and talking about how Canada is helping to drive clean solutions, because we want to make sure that Canadian workers and businesses can benefit from the energy transition that's happening. A lot of investors and individuals are seeking cleaner solutions. So it's important that we're at the table describing what we are doing to take ambitious action. So just to give you some examples on methane, being an oil and gas producing nation, we are doing a lot to reduce emissions in methane, both in oil and gas sector, but waste and landfill and also agriculture sector. And countries are genuinely interested in hearing about our regulations that we've put drafts out to reduce in the oil and gas sector by 75% by 2030. And for companies, they have this Canadian companies have a big opportunity because they are already reducing emissions and advancing innovative technologies to be able to do that. And so it's important that we can talk about how we are reducing and putting in place regulations to enable innovation in Canada, putting in place a carbon price, which also enables innovation. And companies are able to, like GHG Sat, for example, get recognized internationally for its ability to detect methane and help companies reduce and capture that methane, because it does have an economic value to it as well. Another example would be in the nuclear energy. It's important for Canada that we're at the table internationally to talk about nuclear energy and the fact that we are almost 85% of non-emitting energy in Canada. And that's an important draw for a lot of companies who have investors who want them to seek cleaner solutions. So they will now consider Canada more as an option. Our nuclear energy has a lot to bear, a lot of business opportunities as other countries seek cleaner solutions. And we've got decades of experience in providing safe nuclear energy. So those are just a couple of examples of where it's important to talk about what we are doing and to help showcase Canadian innovation that's going on.
Thanks very much.
You did ask about carbon pricing, the Global Carbon Pricing Challenge. I don't know if there's time to speak to that.
What's the time at, Mr. Chair?
There's about a minute and a half.
Yeah, so thank you for that. We had 3 new partners join on to the Global Carbon Pricing Challenge at COP29, Uruguay, Finland, and Nigeria. And this now brings the total to 18 partners and friends who all want to share their experiences in implementing carbon pricing and learn from each other. And that's what this opportunity is about. It gives that leadership, government leadership push, and gives that visibility to carbon pricing. And then other countries have cotton on to this, and they're very interested in sharing experiences. We've had, various events that we've organized, one at COP29, but also in New York during Climate Week, where we've had, interest from the World Trade Organization, from different international organizations recognizing the value of this initiative to drive that awareness internationally.
Thanks. Would you characterize our initiatives to lower our emissions as a huge economic advantage in Canada?
Absolutely. I think, we want to make sure Canada is not misunderstood. I think, there are countries that think that we really aren't doing a lot on climate change. So it's important for companies that we talk about what we're doing and how we're doing it. We're inclusive.
I think, did we lose the ambassador? Anyway, the time was up. But,
thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, that was the end of our 6 minutes.
I'm back.
But we're glad that you're back with us here because we lost you for a few seconds. Madame Posey.
Yeah.
Oui, merci.
Thank you very much, and thank you for being here. Good morning, Ms. Stewart, Your Excellency. It's wonderful to see you again. I would like to talk about our mediocre performance in Canada. My colleague, Mr. Maizière, referred to this, and according to German Watch, Canada is in 62nd position amongst this list, this index that has 67 countries, so we can't boast about that performance. Now, you have international knowledge, and you know that the Advisory Committee in the UK has monthly reports, puts forward changes, the report is distributed, the work is made public, and transparency is there. Would that not be an example that we should follow here in Canada to improve our performance?
On l'entend pas.
We cannot hear her.
Or there's some problem with, we can't hear you.
Pardon me.
Yeah,
Yes.
Go ahead, please. Yeah.
Thank you very much to the honourable member. I would like to turn to Vince Arn, who is at the table, who can speak to that, please.
So thank you, honorable committee members. You have asked a question several times about the climate change performance index. I think that there are caveats that we would like to put forward and share with you. Number one, that particular report assigns significant weight to renewable energy adoption, energy efficiency, and climate policies in countries such as China. Despite being the world's largest emitter, actually, it's relatively well in renewable energy, while Canada's non-emitting power generation
Can I please stop you off there, please?
and nuclear actually are
Yeah,
not
we have to let
included.
Ms.
And therefore, I think that we have to be
Mr.
very cautious
I have to stop you there. I
about
have to stop you there. I have to
Okay.
stop you there.
Je parlais
Sure.
plus précisément du Royaume parce que
I was speaking specifically about the UK because it's a country that's similar to ours. So why do we not draw inspiration from the UK in their approach? And now another question for Ms. Stewart. The GHG emissions have gone down by 8% in 2023 in the EU compared to the past year, thanks to renewable energy, not nuclear energy. We're talking purely about renewable energy, and the net GHG emissions are now lower than 37% compared to 1999 levels, whereas also the GDP has gone up by 68% over the same period. So that shows that there's continual decoupling between emissions and growth. It is possible to do both, and the EU is remaining on the right track to respect its commitments to reduce emissions by at least 55% by 2030. So what is happening in Canada with the increase in the oil sands production sector?
Thanks very much for your question. And certainly when it comes to the UK, Canada has partnered with them on many occasions. And I would just underline the Powering Past Coal Alliance, which Canada and the UK at the ministerial level set up in 2017. That now has over 180 members, including governments, subnational governments, and private sector and investors. That is an initiative that I feel has helped to gain momentum on the importance of coal phase out. And I think it contributed greatly to the COP28 outcome, which recognized the importance of phasing out coal. So that's just an example of how Canada has partnered with some key countries around this world to drive ambition. They've also joined us in the global carbon pricing challenge.
Simplement, je veux pas qu'on parle du charbon.
Madam Stewart, I don't want to talk about coal. I know that there's the Powering Past Coal Alliance and the coal phase out that's already been talked about in the past, but I talk about here the increase in oil production in Canada. We know that the oil sands production is basically the most polluting form of oil production. So what's the future for this type of production when people are respecting the Paris Agreement and they need to reduce their oil consumption?
Yes, and I would just say when it comes to decoupling, it's important to note that Canada has also decoupled its economic growth from its emissions. We know we have more work to do in the oil and gas sector. The minister has introduced draft regulations to put a cap on oil and gas emissions, as I'm sure this committee knows. We've also done a lot of work to introduce an assessment framework and guidelines to help eliminate inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. We're also working on a framework right now to reduce public funding for the fossil fuel sector. We have methane regulations in the oil and gas sector, which I've mentioned, of 75% reduction by 2030. We also have clean electricity regulations that are coming on board.
Je vous arrête là-dessus.
Madam Stewart, could you please talk about GHG reductions? You've said that there will be reductions for the oil and gas production sector of around 35% by 2030 compared to 1999 levels, but the reference year for Canada is, in fact, 2005. We need to have reduced compared to 2005 levels, but for the oil sector, we're taking 1999 as the reference year. So Canada has to aim for a reduction of 40 to 45% in this sector. So why are we not asking the oil and gas sector to do so much by 2030? And why are we not imposing the reference year of 2005 as we've done for all the other sectors?
Thank you very much for your question. I'll turn to Vincent Arn, who's in the room, please.
Briefly, like in about 30 seconds max.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I would just like to add that Canada's approach to reducing emissions does not assume that every sector has to reduce by exactly the same amount. We recognize that every sector has its own unique situation and challenges, and that's why we have a combination of the carbon pricing system, which applies across the economy, but includes an industrial pricing system that recognizes certain sectors are more vulnerable to competitiveness issues and carbon leakage. But then we also realize that additional policies are needed for the highest emitting sectors, such as oil and gas,
stop there and go to Ms.
transportation.
Collins.
Maybe I'll pick up there. Just, each sector has its unique context. And one of the unique contexts of the oil and gas sector is that they are making record profits. They are raking in billions of dollars. And this government still seems comfortable handing out money to this sector, saying that they need to do less than other sectors. It's concerning, but Ms. Stewart, I don't hold you responsible for that. You are not crafting the climate policy. You are our ambassador. And so, like my colleagues before me, I am concerned that Canada has maintained its position at 62nd in this year's Climate Change Performance Index, and that we are, rated as very low in the ratings for GHG emissions, for renewable energy, for energy use categories. But again, that's not something that I hold you personally responsible for. That's something I want the government to step up and change their policies. And so, my questions for you today are really about this new context that we're in. Canadians are rightfully concerned about Trump's recent electoral win, what it means for the future for climate policy. Project 2025 has laid out a pretty clear plan to undo the Environmental Protection Act. I'm concerned about what it will do to undermine the Inflation Reduction Act pieces and what this means for the Paris Agreement. So I'm curious from your perspective, given Trump's tariff threats, his rejection of climate science, that America is Canada's largest trading partner, what can the Canadian government do to reduce emissions with the urgency needed while remaining economically competitive, but also in this new context of a Trump presidency?
Thank you to the honourable member for her question. When it comes to the transition in administration in the U.S., there's a team that's set up within the government, which crosses many government departments, sort of analyzing and anticipating the changes that will come with the new administration. I don't want to speculate and won't speculate right now what those changes will be and what that means, but just so that there is a team in place that is looking at all of that and talking about responding to eventualities when they happen. But I don't engage a lot in that in my current role.
And has it changed at all? Has your team been planning at all for that shift? Have there been conversations either with this government team or has your team been doing any work in preparation for the transition?
I think a lot of my engagement is in plurilateral, multilateral settings. And, there's still many countries that are very committed to climate action and want to hear from Canada. To your earlier point about the fossil fuel sector, I mean, there's a genuine interest in hearing about Canada's experience and what we're doing, and we'll continue to push on that and the policies that we are advancing, because we recognize the urgency of action and the need to engage globally and work together with global partners on it. So we continue to have lots of global partners that want to work with us, and that's the way I look at it as I make my forward planning.
One of the things that came up at previous COPs, at a number of the different COPs, including COP29, but it was the presence of oil and gas lobbyists, and how the industry has played a big role at these conferences. Do you see any conflicts? Do you see it as contradictory that 28 Canadian delegates have ties to oil and gas and that sector, when the goal of COP is really to reduce our global emissions, that this sector is disproportionately responsible for those increasing emissions.
Thanks. I think from Canada's perspective, when it comes to our delegation for COP, we aim to have an inclusive and diverse delegation because we believe everybody needs to be at the table. Everybody needs to be involved in the solution. Provinces and territories put forward their own representatives that they want to see on our delegation. We, as a federal government, pay for Indigenous representatives and youth and civil society to come because we feel their voice is very important.
And
but there are also members of Parliament who come and senators
I wanted
and
to
so
focus
on.
specifically on the oil and gas industry representatives. And I'm curious, given their large numbers, their kind of disproportionate role that they play in these conferences and in COPs in the past and probably in COPs in the future, do you think that COP might achieve bolder agreements if we didn't have that kind of disproportionate representation from this industry?
Rapidly, please, Ms. Stewart.
You know, I think COP outcomes are what parties agree to, and I would just underscore that at COP28 last year, over 190 parties agreed to language that notes the need to transition away from fossil fuels in the energy sector. So, you know, we were able to accomplish quite a bit, and many countries, as they're preparing their climate plans, know what they need to do based on that outcome last year.
Thank you very much. We'll go to our second round. I'll make it a 4-and-2 round because we're a little short of time. Monsieur Deltel pour 4 minutes.
4 minutes, Mr. Deltel. Thank you, Chair, and good morning. And good morning especially to the Ambassador. You're appearing before this standing committee virtually, and that's a very good thing. So why are you here as a virtual witness, whereas you've had 30 trips over the last 2 years with a very high environmental price?
Thank you for your question. I am based in Switzerland. My spouse is posted here from Global Affairs Canada, and I'm here as an accompanying spouse. And so I didn't feel it was necessary to pay the cost to fly to Canada for this committee appearance. And I do take lots of virtual meetings in the course of my role as well.
Oui, d'accord, mais le problème, c'est parce que vous avez visité.
Yes, fine, but you have visited 5 continents, you've travelled everywhere, and your environmental footprint is a very heavy one. Whereas here, it's fine that you are appearing virtually. I prefer that rather than going across the Atlantic twice to speak about the environment. But why have you not had more virtual meetings rather than having 30 trips that have cost taxpayers over $250 million?
Thank you for your question. I do take many virtual meetings as well as engage in person. As Canada's climate ambassador, I have been asked to represent Canada internationally, and so that is why I travel as part of my role. And I do take that responsibility very seriously. And that's why I would like to turn to the Chief Financial Officer who is in the room, who can speak to the rules and the directives that I follow in my role.
Vous dites que vous parlez ça très personnel.
You said that you take that very personally. That's very good. Congratulations. But what has been the environmental bill that you've had to pay? We've talked about 250,000, as we saw in the National Post. What is your environmental bill when you have travelled to over 30 countries and to 5 continents? And personally, what have you paid personally, environmentally, when you could have done it otherwise?
I would like to turn to our Chief Financial Officer to also speak to public servants and the offsets that are made for public travel of public servants, please.
Pouvez-vous m'expliquer pourquoi?
Could you explain why, when you were in Canada, you travelled from Toronto to Ottawa backwards and forwards by plane, but you could in fact have taken the train and shown your attachment to the environment?
Thank you for your question. When I am invited to be somewhere, I do look at all the options, and you know, sometimes it makes more sense. It's faster air travel, as you know, than train. But certainly, I do take this responsibility very seriously.
Oui, ok, alors,
Point of order,
est-ce que vous
Mr.
avez...
Chair.
Yes, so
Point of order, yes.
I'm just wondering about the relevance of this line of questioning to the purported purpose that we have these officials here, rather than grilling them on their specific choices on transportation methods. I think we have some rather larger policy issues that we should be addressing. Don't you agree, Mr. Deltel?
Alors, monsieur,
It's within the frame of the discussion because we're discussing emissions reductions, but I would agree that we're narrowing in on one, an important but nonetheless partial aspect of a very broad issue, if I can put it that way. But it's Mr. Deltel's time, so you've got a minute left.
Monsieur le Président, c'est sur une question de règlement.
I'm sorry.
just this isn't a point of order.
Yeah,
I've got another comment.
as a response to your point of, but it's not a point of order. Well, not
Well, it's
really.
it's on relevance.
You could call it a point of order, but
Point of order on
was
relevance,
eating my-
Yeah,
because
point of order on relevance.
we're talking about Government of Canada's 2030
No, I
target for
understand.
reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We're not talking about the
Budget?
ambassador's personal
I
travel
know,
schedule.
I understand that. It
We have
is,
about
it is far from the core of the issue, but
Bon.
Mr. Deltel, would you like to respond to that?
Très bien. Alors, dans la lettre de mandat de
In the mandate letter from the ambassador, it said that Canada's environmental policies need to be put into practice. So taking the plane rather than train and having meetings abroad over the 5 continents when you can actually do it virtually, is that really the government policies of this Liberal government?
I would like to turn to the Chief Financial Officer to talk about public servants' travel. Thank you.
Merci.
Go ahead. Is it Ms. Drainville? Yeah.
Pour la question.
Thank you for that question. Now, as you know, before undertaking travel, each official is very much encouraged to look at all of the possible means available, depending on why they have to travel, if it's appropriate to do it virtually, or if it's better to take the train or the plane, and who pays the environmental bill, who foots the bill. Is it the person who's travelling or the government? It's the government who pays the environmental bill. So then we wash our hands and say, OK, we're buying trees, and that means we can continue to have trips throughout the world. Of course, the government, the current government, has a way of doing things, buying credits and offsets. What's the total of the credits that Canadian taxpayers have bought? Now, Mr. Van Koeven, for 4 minutes.
Actually, I think it's me, Chair, please.
It's all the same to me. If it's Mr. Longfield,
Okay.
go ahead. But I have Mr. Van Koeverden on the list, but go ahead, Mr. Longfield.
Okay, thank you, Chair. And Ambassador Stewart, it's great to have you here to talk about more than micromanaging your expense accounts from our committee, which might not be the best use of either of our time. On Friday, I was in the Port of Hamilton with our Minister of Transportation, Minister Anand, and with the chair of the Agriculture Committee, Cody Blois. And we met with the shipping companies in the Port of Hamilton and with P&H Milling, where they were talking about record wheat crops coming in to the port. Terrific news from our farmers doing an outstanding job in feeding the world. But we did have a conversation around the use of biofuel on freighters. We don't often talk about freighter traffic. Usually we're talking about trucks and cars. They were saying the opportunity for biodiesel is a real opportunity for them. I was saying, how about nitrogen? Have you looked at nitrogen? I've done some work in the past on stationary nitrogen power units. Where are we at in terms of helping shipping companies? They were going to Africa, they were going to the EU, they had customers in Belgium, going around the world with ships. Where are we at in terms of promoting biodiesel?
Thank you for your question. And I'm not sure if Megan Nichols, who's in the room, is able to answer that. Otherwise, I'd be very happy to follow up on that.
Certainly.
A follow-up might be good in terms of our managing time, but thank you, Ms. Nichols, for being here, because I would like to give a detailed response to the shipping companies involved, as well as P&H, who are working together to try and reduce their footprint. They are looking at emissions from oil and gas on ships as one of their opportunities. But you also mentioned methane and agriculture, and there's the Guelph Statement in Ontario where working on sustainable agriculture practices and reducing methane outputs on the farm, particularly around dairy cattle and other cattle. Could you maybe comment on the importance of methane reduction initiatives with our agriculture community who are embracing these?
Yes, and thank you very much for your question. And I've met with members from the agriculture community, and they are indeed embracing many new innovative ways of trying to reduce emissions, including through enteric fermentation, looking at different ways of harvesting crops and livestock and tillage and so on. Like, there's so much innovation going on. And the government has launched a agriculture methane challenge as an example of one way of helping farmers promote that innovation to something that can be quite scalable. So we still have quite a bit of work to do in the agriculture sector on methane, but Canadian farmers are innovating and are trying to reduce their footprint. And there are, this methane challenge is one program, but there are other programs that the government is advancing to try to help in that regard. And we could follow up on that as well.
Thank you. And in your travels, I was managing director of a Canadian division of a German company that was doing work of methane electricity production on the farm. Germany is a leader in that area. Canada, not so much. Is part of your role transferring technology?
So part of my role is also learning what the technologies are that are out there, and also noting Canada's keen interest and, where possible, helping to connect companies to the solutions that are being asked for.
Thank you.
Thank you for your work.
Madame Posey pour 2 minutes.
2 minutes, Madame Posey. Quickly, Madame Ambassador, Canada has to present its NDCs, nationally determined contributions. When will it decide to set the ones for 2035, and when will it render this public?
Thank you very much to the honourable member for her question. I will turn to Vincent Arn, who has been working on our NDC, to answer that question, please.
Thank you. And it will be in 2025.
En 2025. Et quand la rendra-t-il?
So in 2025, and when will it be rendered public? Will it be rendered public?
UNFCCC, and then will be made public accordingly.
Okay. Merci beaucoup. Une autre question par rapport.
Thank you very much. Another question on the oil and gas production sector. The CO2 emissions linked to energy have to be reduced by 80% by 2035 by all developed countries, and all countries have to contribute. And the International Energy Agency, in its net zero scenario, says that we shouldn't be opening up any new oil and gas fields. Why is Canada still pursuing this?
Thank you very much for your question. And it's just important to know that in my role, I advocate for what Canada is doing to help reduce emissions in the oil and gas sector. There's also recognition that there will be a continued need for oil and gas. And, the IEA also says that there will continue to be a need in 2050, albeit a much reduced need. So it's important to be able to highlight what we are doing as a producer in driving down emissions in Canada.
But, Madam Ambassador, you know that the International Energy Agency also says that we have to have a reduction of 80% by 2035. Now, quickly, what is the IPCC saying about the reduction potential of carbon and capture and storage and its cost compared to other GHG reduction techniques?
Because we're well over time now.
Sorry, I didn't quite catch the question.
Well, it was about what
Qu'est-ce que le GIEC? C'est ça vraiment, qu'est-ce que le GIEC dit à propos du captage et stockage?
What is the IPCC saying about the carbon capture reductions compared to other GHG reduction techniques?
You can have 10 seconds. What does the International Energy Agency say about carbon capture and storage and the cost I guess, relative to other options. Is there...
Thank you. I don't have that information at my
Okay,
fingertips.
Thank you. Ms. Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, and thanks again, Ms. Stewart. I do just want to quickly highlight the hypocrisy of Conservative members kind of taking this tact on in-person versus virtual when they voted against virtual options for members of Parliament, and many of their members scoffed when climate concerns were raised. And so well, I appreciate, Ms. Stewart, that you are virtually attending this, and I'm glad that you're aware and making choices each time and taking into consideration the emissions. I do think that line of questioning was kind of reeked of hypocrisy. But I do want to ask you specifically about the emissions from exported Canadian oil and gas. We know that these emissions have skyrocketed. From 2012 to 2023, they increased by 58%. The Environment Commissioner's reports show that Canada isn't on track to meet our target of 40 to 45%. But these emissions are emissions that are undermining global efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so greenhouse gas emissions don't know borders, as I know you are aware. Can you talk about these emissions that will kind of come back to haunt us when we're exporting them? Isn't it in our interest to decrease our emissions from exports?
I think it's in everyone's interest to reduce emissions in the oil and gas sector, and that's why Canada is showing leadership internationally on this front. We were the first country to introduce a framework assessment against inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, as an example. We're also the first country to introduce a cap, an oil and gas emissions cap, and our ambitious methane reduction regulations. There are many examples of things we are doing in the oil and gas sector, and it's important to underscore that.
It does seem like, though, you were talking about emissions intensity before, when emissions intensity won't necessarily make a difference when it comes to what we're exporting. If we're increasing our production, increasing our exports, even if we make that more efficient, and maybe that helps us in our individual targets as a country, if we're exporting oil and gas and we're increasing that and still continuing, even though...
we have to go to Mr. Leslie now, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ambassador, I'd like to start on the international shipping industry. Minister Guilbeault was quoted in the Toronto Star recently that he was very supportive of the new proposed global carbon tax on international shipping. But when he came to committee last week, he kind of pretended that he's never said those words before. So I'm curious, have you in your capacity been involved in any conversations with anybody within the government or the international community about this new global carbon tax on international shipping?
Thanks for your question. The Department of Transport manages our participation in negotiations at the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, and I think they would be better placed to answer that question, so I'm happy to follow up with more information on that.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, Mr. Van Koeverden, on your point of order.
I'd like to provide Mr. Leslie the opportunity to correct the record on his misquote of the minister.
Okay, which aspect maybe, or it's the point of debate actually, but
yes.
It's a point of debate.
But we can't be misquoting ministers in the meeting.
Well, it's not a good practice, and the people, there should be corrections made, but we'll have to wait till the Liberals turn to, I guess, correct the record. But it's noted that you feel the quote was not accurate.
Point of order. I'll point of order this one. I'd like to table a document from the Toronto Star that's titled Trudeau government backs talks for a levy on shipping to help developing nations fight climate change. And in the byline, it says Environment Minister Guilbeault says the federal government is, quote, very supportive of talks to create a new levy on greenhouse gas emissions from maritime transportation. So if I could table that with unanimous consent, Mr. Chair?
Well, I don't know if this is, I know people do this rise in the House and ask to table things, but in committee, is there such a procedure as tabling documents? You can send it to the clerk, and the clerk can get it translated and distributed. Now, we're going to continue. You have 3 minutes left, Mr. Leslie.
Might I respond to that, Mr. Chair?
No, I'm afraid you can't, Mr. Van Koeverden. So we'll go to Mr. Leslie for 3 more minutes.
Ambassador, in your capacity, and I appreciate transport maybe to lead through the International Maritime Organization, but have on the sidelines of perhaps the recent COP or any other conversations you've had, has this ever come up?
So reducing emissions.
Sorry, I have
Point of order, Chair.
Monsieur Leslie,
Mr. Leslie asked to table a document, I believe, in the committee. I said if you want to do that, you would have to send it in, because first of all, it needs to be in the 2 official languages, and if he wants to share this document with the committee members, he has to send it to the clerk. And has he done that through a point of order? He needs to translate it and then send it to all the members through the clerk. Well, through this point of order, tabling a document, I would also like us to table the analysis of 300 economists who said there's no better way of going through an economic and energy transition than through carbon pricing. If you want to table that document, then we can distribute it.
Leslie.
I think I am over a target here that the current government doesn't really want to talk about, so I'll let the ambassador finish her response.
Yeah, and I would just say thank you for your question. I engage in conversations about reducing emissions in every sector because we're in a climate crisis and the world needs to do more across the board. So whether it's, oil and gas sector, agriculture sector, methane, shipping, aviation, the conversations are happening globally everywhere so that we can do more. And I know Megan Nichols around the table could speak a little bit more about the International Maritime Organization in particular.
Sure, go ahead, Ms. Nichols.
Sure, happy to do so. The International Maritime Organization has been working for a number of years now to identify potential pathways for the international shipping sector to reduce its emissions. It's one of the highest emitters on the transportation sector and very challenging to decarbonize. And one of the options that's being discussed at the IMO is a carbon levy, along with also the concept of a low-carbon fuel standard. So these are live discussions that are happening that Canada is participating in.
So obviously Canada is supportive if they are participating in it, and I guess the question is, has there been reflection on the economic impact on Canadians that are already struggling with that as part of these conversations?
All countries who are IMO members participate in the discussions, so regardless of their position on this particular concept or not. In terms of the economic impact, that is indeed part of the assessment of all of the different options that are on the table at the IMO, looking at the impact on states, including those that are more countries in the path of development.
Okay. Ambassador, the Liberals, as outlined by the Parliamentary Environment Commissioner, are failing to meet their emissions target. In fact, they have the worst record in the G7, despite us having a punishing carbon tax that is driving up the cost of everything and making us less competitive. So the U.S. is ranked above us, which doesn't have a carbon tax. In your conversations, how is it possible they have a better track record than Canada?
So thanks for your question. I think, we have very good relationships with G7 colleagues who want to hear about Canada's experience. And, they know that not everything's easy. It wouldn't be called ambitious if it was easy. So I think it's important to share our experience and learn from each other.
Thank you.
Certainly, Canada has a unique situation being who we are.
Thank you. We're going to go to Madame Chatel for 4 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Stewart, in 2024, world energy investments should reach a record of $3,000 billion. And several have shown a direct positive correlation between the environmental performance of a business and how attractive it actually would be for that type of investment. GHG reductions by companies often seen as a positive signal for investors. So I've listened to my Conservative colleagues earlier saying that we should no longer talk about carbon pricing at a global level, I've got bad news for them. The world is setting as a priority this type of approach for economic and business opportunity reasons. In March 2024, over 300 Canadian economists signed an open letter in favour of a carbon pricing strategy here in Canada. And they underlined the fact that carbon pricing reduces emissions at a lower cost than any other approach. So either the Conservatives have no interest in attracting foreign investment to Canada, and that would be terrible for our economy. So, Madam Stewart, can you explain to us the enormous business opportunities for our Canadian companies thanks to our climate change policies?
Thank you very much for your question. And it's definitely clear that there are many economic opportunities out there for Canadian companies who are innovating in clean tech, in cleaner solutions. It is very true that investors are interested in investing in cleaner solutions, which is one reason why we are leading on the cement and concrete breakthrough. It brings governments and businesses together to work together on how they can advance abatement technologies, because there are huge economic opportunities there. And by bringing the two government and businesses together, we can make sure that we are promoting the right policies, and carbon pricing has been one of them. We had Heidelberg Cement at an event recently in New York where they underscored the importance of carbon pricing and the predictability that it provides for investments that the cement and concrete sector is taking as an example. There are other examples I could provide, but I will leave it there.
Madame Stewart,
Ms. Stewart, international organizations such as the UN and the OECD and all of these other international organizations are having discussions on the best way of going towards a green transition and are attracting investments to their countries. So does that astonish you that they're taking this approach?
I would not. I'm not surprised that there's a lot of work being done to highlight the economic opportunities that exist with greener solutions. And I think, many companies out there will underscore the opportunities that have been open to them because they've been able to show how they can produce things in a cleaner way. I think Canada also...
Êtes-vous surprise, Madame?
Are you surprised that my Conservative colleagues are trying to prevent people from talking about one of the best policy tools that we have to attract these investments to the economy of tomorrow? Well, fortunately for you, time has ran out, Madam Stewart. So thank you very much for having been with us. It's been a real pleasure to meet with you virtually and have these discussions. And thank you to all of the department officials who are also with us this morning. So now we're going to have a brief break while we check the connections for our video conference participants for the next panel. Thank you very much.
We have on the line Mr. Normand Mousseau, professeur Institut de l'énergie Trottier de l'Université de Montréal. Et
and his sound tests have been completed successfully. Everything's fine there. And then
Institute, we have Dale Bigin, okay, Executive Vice President. He's accompanied, yes, and then from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, we have Devin Drover, Atlantic Director and General Counsel, who was accompanied by counsel or support staff. And from Environmental Defence Canada, we have Julia Levin, Associate Director, National Climate. Yes, okay, so we'll start with Mr. Mousseau for 5 minutes online. Mr. Mousseau, go ahead, please. Vous êtes en sourdine.
Voilà.
You're on mute. Thank you very much, Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, MPs, the report of the Commissioner of Sustainable Development and Environment on Canada's progress in terms of GHG emission reduction has shown that real progress has been made over the last 10 years, but this does not allow us to reach the targets that have been set for 2030 nor for 2050. These analyses are in line with the results of the technical mobilisation we put forward in our third outlook on perspectives for Canadian energy, which come out every 3 years, and they look at the policies that have been put forward in a reference scenario, and we compare the results with the necessary change that needs to be made to achieve net zero in 2050. The results of our work are as follows. First of all, if we include the regulations on clean electricity and the zero-emission vehicles, which have been put forward but are not further yet adopted, that would show that for the first time, the reference scenario where the GHG emissions would go down Canada compared to 2005 are possible. And the 3% increase that was put forward by 3 years has now changed. There would, in fact, be a 14% reduction of GHG emissions by 2030 compared to 2005 and 25% by 2040 compared to the 2005 levels. But if we look at the gap between our net zero scenarios and the reference scenarios for 2030, this brings us to the conclusion that technically it's not possible to meet Canada's 2030 targets. So as of now, we have to introduce measures for the longer term so that we can bring about deep transformation if we really want to reach net zero by 2050. Another important aspect here is that even if we have federal regulations on ZEVs, which joins together with provinces' efforts, the main efforts that we've seen for the next years leading to decarbonisation comes from the federal level. The provinces are not making many structural efforts when it comes to decarbonising the economy. But given that energy falls under provincial jurisdiction, Canada has to go even further and get the provinces on board. And then there's the question of industrial carbon pricing. We don't think that this will really lead to significant reductions in the industrial sector. Other measures will be needed. There needs to be further regulatory measures. So we agree with the Commissioner on the Environment and Sustainable Development. One aspect which has been overlooked is that part of the problem that's slowing down the implementation of measures is linked to the lack of cooperation with the provinces and a lack of cooperation between the different federal political parties, which means that the federal government has to work even harder to develop regulations, and then there are legal disputes, and we do not know if they will survive a change of government. When we look at what's happening abroad, things work when all the political parties are rowing in the same direction to reach the targets and attain this transformative decarbonisation. An important aspect which I would like to mention is that following on from the recommendations from the CESD in a previous report, efforts have been deployed to improve retrofits, and also there has been better modelling with other institutes, including our Trottier Institute and also the Victoria School of Social Studies at the University of Calgary, also to work on modelling and improve the quality of modelling. So things are improving there. In order to accelerate the transition now, unless the provinces jump on board the train and unless we have true collaboration, the federal government really has to work on the environmental side. So we think there needs to be stricter environmental standards. The federal government also has to develop reduction policies by figures by sector for decarbonisation. There are several ways of doing that. And we also need to support upscaling pilot projects for the heavy emitter sectors and various industrial sectors. We think that's the only way in which we will make progress. Thank you very much, Professor.
Eugene, for 5 minutes.
Thanks very much, members of the committee. Thanks for your time. I'd like to make 4 points today. First, current policies, both provincial and federal, are working. The Climate Institute's independent analysis uses economic modeling to show that absent federal, provincial, territorial climate policies in place since 2015, national emissions would be on track to be 41% higher in 2030 than they otherwise would have been. Trends in current emissions reinforce those findings. The Institute's new early estimates of national emissions show that current emissions are around 7% below 2005 levels. Since 2017, shifts towards lower carbon sources of energy have reduced annual emissions by 50 megatons. Improvements in energy efficiency have reduced emissions by 62 megatons. These reductions are greater than increases in emissions from growth in the economy, showing that Canada is decoupling growth of the economy from growth in emissions. Second point, swift policy implementation is a priority both for competitiveness and for emissions reductions. Achieving the full potential of policies not yet finalized requires implementing those policies pretty quickly. Policies take time to affect emissions. As the Commissioner on the Environment and Sustainable Development noted, slower implementation of planned policies will decrease emissions reductions in 2030. Implementation also matters for competitiveness. Policy certainty, for example, in the details of investment tax credits, increases investment. It seems likely that at least some elements of the Inflation Reduction Act will be maintained in the United States. Canadian climate policy can help Canada attract investment to drive new sources of economic growth. Third point, ensuring existing policies are working, especially industrial carbon pricing, is critical. Climate Institute analysis finds that large emitter trading systems, otherwise known as industrial carbon pricing, are Canada's most important climate policy, delivering up to half of the emissions reductions expected in 2030 from the main policies in the Federal Emissions Reductions Plan. That's about 3 times the emissions reductions, for example, expected from the consumer carbon tax. Examples of these large emitting trading systems include Alberta's TIER program, Quebec's cap-and-trade system, and the federal backstop. When designed well, these trading systems drive both emissions reductions and competitiveness. These systems protect the competitiveness of existing industries while maintaining incentives to reduce emissions. Carbon credits also provide essential revenue for low-carbon projects such as carbon capture and storage, clean electricity, clean steel, helping them to attract private investment. These systems will only deliver these benefits if they're working as designed. Our analysis suggests that some credit markets are currently unbalanced in these systems. Excess supply of credits can devalue carbon credits, undermining their ability to help attract private investment and reduce emissions. Insufficiently stringent performance standards are one issue, leading to more supply and less demand for carbon credits. Monitoring and updating policies over time can ensure they deliver on emissions and competitiveness benefits. Fourth, addressing interactions between policies matters for efficacy, for cost effectiveness, and for competitiveness. In some cases, different policies overlap in terms of the emissions they cover. Government should assess and manage those interactions carefully. Policy interactions mean that additional policies don't necessarily drive the same scale of additional emissions reductions they deliver on their own. For example, policies such as investment tax credits can enable new low-carbon projects, but at the same time, they make it easier to generate credits in those large emitting trading systems, increasing supply of credits and decreasing demand, thus depressing the effective price of carbon and the emissions reductions from industrial carbon pricing. Those policy interactions also risk increasing overall costs, potentially increasing higher cost emissions reductions, but decreasing lower cost emissions reductions. Policy interactions can also undermine competitiveness by creating uncertainty about future credit prices. Attracting investment for large low-carbon projects depends not just on current prices for carbon credits, but also expected future prices. Interactions increase the risk that future carbon credits will have lower value. Governments can address policy interactions either by streamlining policy packages or by explicitly accounting for interactions and adjusting policies to compensate. To conclude, overall, emissions reductions in Canada, delivering on emissions reductions in Canada is not a pass-fail test. Current policies are working, but we're short of the target. More stringent, more coherent policy packages with more policy stringency will drive more emissions reductions and more private investment. Thank you very much.
We'll go now to Mr. Drover.
Thank you for the invitation to be here today. My name is Devin Drover. I'm the General Counsel and Atlantic Director with the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, and are here today on behalf of thousands of Canadian taxpayers who want to see the carbon tax scrapped. This is for three key reasons. First, the carbon tax makes life too expensive. Secondly, Canadians should not be punished for the necessities of life, like driving to work or getting groceries, and the carbon tax is ultimately not working. First, let's talk about that cost to Canadians. It's currently $80 per tonne, which adds 18 cents to a litre of gasoline, 21 cents to a litre of diesel, and 15 cents to a cubic metre of natural gas. If you look at this, this costs about an extra $13 for someone to fill up a minivan, $20 extra to fill up a pickup truck, and about $200 extra to fill up a big rig truck with diesel. And let's talk about truckers. Nearly everything we need is brought by a truck. This is no more true than in my home province of Newfoundland and Labrador, where food is delivered by boat to the island's west coast and then trucked 900 kilometers to the island's east coast, where most of the population is. When you charge a carbon tax of 21 cents per litre on diesel, you are charging more for everything. And the Canadian Trucking Alliance came out, says the federal carbon tax will cost that industry about $2 billion this year. And it's not just about the truckers. Let's talk about farmers who grow the food that the truckers bring. They pay the carbon tax on fuels they use to heat their barns, dry grain, and keep livestock alive throughout the very cold winter. The PBO, the Parliamentary Budget Officer, says the carbon tax will cost Canadian farmers $1 billion extra by the year 2030. And I'd like to use this opportunity briefly to thank the members of the Conservative Party, the NDP, and the Bloc for voting to exempt farm fuels from the carbon tax. I understand the bill has been gutted by the Senate and sent back to the House, the unelected Senate, but that's a matter for another day. Let's talk about home heating. We live in a very cold country, and heating our homes is essential for survival. The government admitted that this is a problem when they exempted, for political gains, one would argue, certain fuels for predominantly benefiting Atlantic Canadians. Yet across this country, people are still struggling to heat their homes who did not receive any form of exemption. For example, the average Alberta household will pay about $440 extra for home heating this winter. It's no surprise that there's a constitutional challenge launched in Alberta to these exemptions. And we wish this government would consider the position of the late leader of the NDP, Jack Layton, who even opposed putting a carbon tax on home heating fuels because ultimately it is wrong. Secondly, let's talk about affordability. Canadians should not be punished for the basics of life, driving to work, heating their homes. They have, in most cases, no other choice but to do those things. Yet about half of Canadians are within $200 of not being able to make the minimum monthly payments on their bills. These people are scraping by. We're hearing from them every day, receiving letters and emails from supporters who are pulled very difficultly by this carbon tax. And we can go back again to the recent PBO report that shows the carbon tax will cost the average household about $400 extra this year, more than $900 by the year 2030, and that's with the rebates factored in. So despite what the Prime Minister said in Brazil, I think those families who are in survival mode, they rightly value feeding their children over paying his carbon tax. Lastly, the carbon tax is not working. In British Columbia, where this tax was first brought in Canada, the government promised a 33% reduction in emissions below 2007 levels by 2020. Instead, emissions went up by more than 2%. In 2021, the federal government said it would reduce emissions by 40 to 45% below 2005 levels, and the data is clearly showing that this is not happening, where we went up in emissions. Overall, this carbon tax experiment is a failure. It is causing huge financial gain without the promised environmental gain. It's making life too expensive, and Canadians should not be punished for driving to work and heating their homes. And ultimately, it's not working, and thus, on behalf of thousands of Canadian taxpayers, we are here today to ask the government to scrap this carbon tax. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Drover. Ms. Levin, for 5 minutes, please, Max.
Thank you for the invitation to appear before you today. Though Canada has begun to bend the curve on emissions, we know we're not achieving the pace and scale needed to hit our current targets, which are themselves insufficient and do not represent Canada's global fair share of efforts. One of the main reasons for this lack of progress is pressure from oil and gas executives. While other sectors, especially electricity, have been able to reduce their pollution levels, oil and gas emissions keep rising. In fact, the sector now represents nearly a third of our domestic emissions, despite only making up 3% of Canada's GDP, 0.7% of jobs, and 0.7% of national revenue. These executives spend a considerable amount of time and energy attacking climate progress. In 2023, the industry lobbyists registered 1,255 meetings with the federal government, averaging out to 5 times per workday, and that's only what's in the Federal Lobby Registry. That's why new rules to cap carbon dioxide and methane emissions from the oil and gas industry are so crucial. However, the current design of the proposed draft regulations will not drive the necessary emissions cuts. Essentially, the rules only ask companies to do what they've publicly said they can. And although it's essential to have that backstop because industry has never lived up to any of its voluntary commitments, we know that deeper cuts are necessary. The government's emission reduction plan indicated that to reach Canada's target, emissions from oil and gas industry would need to fall to 42% below 2019 levels. The proposed regulations, when you discount the compliance flexibilities and the loopholes, will only drive down emissions by less than 30% and far less if the assumed emission reductions between now and 2026 don't materialize. In fact, ECCC only estimates a 13.4 megaton reduction from these rules, from a sector producing over 200 megatons yearly. So stronger rules are needed, and more importantly, they must be implemented urgently. We know that tackling the climate crisis requires replacing fossil fuels with renewable energy. Though this is no small task, the good news is that renewable energy trumps fossil fuels on every level: price, reliability, ease of deployment, and job growth opportunities. Renewable energy with battery storage is now a cheaper way to produce electricity than fossil fuels. That's why global renewable energy installations grew by 50% around the world last year alone. Despite these advantages, Canada is falling behind the rest of the G20 in terms of deploying renewable energy and battery. That's why the proposed clean electricity regulations are crucial, but the final rules must actually displace fossil gas from the grid. The clean electricity regulations will provide system operators, power producers, and investors with the certainty that Canada wants in the clean energy transformation. In addition to these regulations, the federal government has a role to play in facilitating the build-out of a clean energy grid by investing in transmission infrastructure. In addition to electrification, an expanded focus on energy efficiency is required. The federal government has a role to play in making our lives, our homes, our industries more energy efficient. Energy retrofits have the additional benefit of lowering household bills and making our homes more comfortable. The science is clear. Existing levels of oil and gas production will lead us to a catastrophic future. This is the reason that at COP28 last year, all of the world's countries agreed to transition away from coal, oil, and gas. At the very minimum, governments must stop facilitating the expansion of the industry. For the Government of Canada, that includes finally ending the provision of subsidies and public financing to oil and gas companies. Though Canada has taken some steps on this, the action to date has not translated into significantly lower levels of financial support, which surpassed $18 billion last year. The government is currently developing new rules to address public financing from Crown corporations, but there is concern that these might be too full of loopholes to actually turn off the taps. We also must ensure we are being vigilant against the dangerous distractions that will do nothing to reduce emissions, but will make it easier for oil and gas production to expand, especially carbon capture in the oil and gas sector and blue hydrogen. As a climate advocate, obviously my focus is on tackling the climate crisis. But transitioning off of fossil fuels is just as much about affordability. Climate solutions like electrified public transit, heat pumps, energy retrofits mean cheaper bills for Canadians. They've saved Canadian families thousands of dollars. Of course, government funding is a necessary enabler for families to access those savings. It's also about ensuring Canada's competitiveness. When we hear arguments on the need to be the country that sells the last barrel of oil, that's like arguing to be the last Blockbuster to rent videos. Why are we so resistant to building an economy that can thrive in the future? Regardless of what we do in Canada, demand for oil and gas is going to peak before 2030 and significantly decline thereafter.
Unfortunately, Ms. Levin, we've run out of time. We're going to go to the first round of questions. I'm going to make it a 4-minute round and the second round a 3-minute round so that we can finish on time. Mr. Cram.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you to all the witnesses for being here today. I would like to start with Mr. Drover from the Canadian Taxpayer Federation. Mr. Drover, from what I understand of your organization, you are not necessarily opposed to all taxes at all times, but you tend to focus on getting good value for tax dollars, and so Canadians can get good value for their money. Is that correct?
Thank you for the question. I mean, our mandate is finding ways to reduce all taxes in Canada to make sure the government is held accountable. So I wouldn't characterize it quite like that, but it is to make sure that we're cutting taxes, put as much money back in the pockets of taxpayers.
Okay, very good. So in that context, last Thursday in question period, Environment Minister Steven Guilbeault stated that the carbon tax in Canada is, quote, generating $25 billion worth of investment every year in our economy. It is putting more money in the pockets of 8 out of 10 Canadians, unquote. Mr. Drover, does that statement match the observations of your members and your observations of Canadians in general?
Absolutely not. First, if we want to talk about the macro side of the macroeconomic impact of the carbon tax, the government's own data shows that it's costing Canadians $11.9 billion this year. That's $295 gone out of the economy for every Canadian. But also, I mean, if you look at the every individual that is forced to pay this carbon tax on everything they purchase, I would certainly think that it's not good for Canadians as a whole. We look at, I think about my mother-in-law who lives in a small community in rural Newfoundland. She has to commute 43 kilometers a day each way for work. She has no public transit. There's no electrical public transit available. There's no electric charging stations. She has no other choice but to incur the carbon tax day in and day out just to get to work. So I absolutely disagree that it's providing benefit for Canadian taxpayers.
Okay, and earlier in this committee meeting, we heard from Canada's climate change ambassador, and she was asked, quote, would you characterize our efforts to address climate change as a huge economic advantage in Canada? And her answer was yes, absolutely. So when you consider climate policies in Canada, such as the carbon tax, would you characterize that as a huge economic advantage for Canada?
Absolutely not. And just to, you've mentioned in your questioning the PBO report. If you look at the PBO report in terms of not only just the direct costs, but also the economic impact of the PBO report, it's wrong to classify that all Canadians or the average Canadian household will be better off. In fact, the average Canadian household will be paying more in carbon tax than they get back in the rebates once you factor in the negative impact the carbon tax is having on things like employment in this country.
Now, many Canadians, I think, would probably be surprised to learn that Canada has a climate change ambassador. So she and her office are based in Switzerland, and part of her job includes promoting the Global Carbon Pricing Challenge, which is basically to promote the carbon tax to foreign countries. Would the Taxpayers Federation consider this sort of activity a good use or not so good use of Canadian tax dollars?
I think it should be no surprise to any attendee here today to understand that we think that's an absolute waste of money. At points where Canadians are struggling to get by, when people are living paycheck to paycheck, we absolutely shouldn't be funding global ambassadors to spend our tax money traveling around to lavish parties talking about how great our Canadian carbon tax is when it's hurting Canadians.
Okay, time is up. We'll go to Ms. Taylor-Roy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just want to correct the record on a few fronts to start, because there's been a lot of misinformation again in this meeting. And when it comes to Bill C-234, first of all, assertion was made in testimony that farmers are paying tax on everything they do. We know that over 90% of fuels that farmers use are already exempt from the carbon levy. The ones that were being discussed in Bill C-234 were two that were left for heating barns and for grain drying. The bill had come to a point where it was going to exempt the grain drying because there weren't alternatives. And it's already...
Mr. Mazur has a point of order.
It's inaccurate. You're actually spreading more misinformation.
This is for everybody.
Farmers pay a carbon tax and everything.
Mr. Mazur, this is, challenging everyone's, what everyone says, this could be an interminable game. I mean, it's Ms. Taylor-Roy's has the floor. Some of the things, that have been said on the Conservative side have been challenged. This, as I say, it could go on forever. So, Ms. Taylor-Roy, and if Mr. Drover disagrees, he can answer in such a way to Ms. Taylor-Roy. Ms. Taylor-Roy, continue, please.
Thank you. And I think people and farmers know that farm fuels are exempt from the carbon tax. So I would just say that we can verify that by looking at the actual bill, if you'd like. But the other thing is that bill is been reported back to the House. It's not moving forward because every time it comes up, the Conservative Party decides to trade a bill up, put it in front of it, or debates it, and has not allowed it to go to a vote. So I'm just wondering, the idea that somehow we're not allowing this to go forward is incorrect. I just wanted to correct that. The other thing I'd like to correct was something in one of Mr. Leslie's questions, where he again stated that the carbon levy was increasing the price of everything and causing an affordability crisis. And just for the record, I'd like to state and make sure that people are aware that there is a Canada carbon rebate, that is more than people are paying out of their pockets. And when you say, Mr. Drover, that people are paying more, an impact to the economy does not make them pay more, and it is not divided across all Canadians in a consistent way. In fact, the PBO report that you're referring to was a projection out to 2030 that showed that the difference in the GDP would be $2.66 trillion versus $2.68 trillion, less than 0.5% reduction. And it doesn't in any way cost the costs of climate events in there. So I think that, we have to show things in relation and be sure that we have the facts right. So that's just where I wanted to start on that. But I'd like to turn my question to Mr. Begin. Is that correct? Thank you, Bijan. And this morning there was a Canadian Press article talking about the clean electricity regulations and their marginal costs in the context of Ontario's electricity grid. Can you share what you believe the actual pocketbook impacts of expanding and decarbonizing our electricity grid at the same time, and why that is going to be positive?
I don't have an estimate of dollars for you. We have done work showing that making a bigger, cleaner, more flexible electricity system is both essential to delivering on net zero objectives, but also going to lead to a decrease in energy costs for Canadians over time. And that we have Energy Wallet work. The Electricity Grid Council just recently released new work showing the same finding, that the costs over time of decarbonizing will lead to lower energy costs, and that includes operating costs and capital costs and baking those in.
And I've also seen and heard that a lot of industries that are coming into Ontario are coming here because of our clean electricity grid, and that will attract further investment into Ontario. Is that correct?
I think that is correct. We're seeing over and over again firms looking for, again, clean, affordable, reliable power as one of the biggest determinants of where they are investing and where they are siting new projects. I think that's reflected in the fact that we're now seeing private firms procuring clean electricity as part of their business plan.
Okay.
Yeah. Merci, Madame Taylor-Roy. Madame Posey.
Thank you. And now, Madame Posey. Thank you to all of our witnesses for being here. Mr. Mousseau, you talked about the question of competencies and jurisdiction, so that will help me. Last week, we heard from the Minister of the Environment, and there was a question that I put to him, and we're always told the same thing anyway. As a member of the bloc, we should know that natural resources fall to provincial jurisdiction rather than federal jurisdiction. But there are two matters that fall to the federal level, the pipelines, the Trans Mountain pipeline, therefore. And also, the minister knew very well that I was referring to offshore fossil fuels that are jointly managed between the federal and the provincial level. So the federal government does have responsibility there. And I'll read out the Library of Parliament notes where it says that the question of competence when it comes to natural resources that are offshore has already been regulated back in 1994. The federal court decided that Canada has the legislative competence when it comes to the exploitation rights offshore from Newfoundland because of its residual powers when it comes to good governance and peace and law and order. So we're talking here about biodiversity as well as these energy matters. That's very important. So who is right here? Is it the Supreme Court, the Library of Parliament, the offshore agencies, me or the Minister? Could you please pick this apart for me? Well, I must admit right away that I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding is that the federal level does have jurisdiction over the continental shelf. We saw a bill last year to set up a new structure with the provinces and the federal level to manage the deployment of, for example, offshore wind farms. Yes, there's the offshore wind farms, but also drilling projects in zones offshore that are classified as marine refuges. As the government is going to continue to approve the North Bay project, fortunately that doesn't exist anymore because investors have understood this is not interesting. But can you talk about the impact on these projects and the fact that the government of Canada is not going to reach or is not reaching its GHG reduction targets? Well, in a purely Canadian context, emissions related to offshore extraction are lower compared to oil sands extraction. So in terms of reductions, we should choose industries that are going to reduce their emissions at a net level. The export of oil means that oil that's burnt off itself is then not the formal responsibility of the Government of Canada. It's production that's the responsibility of the Government of Canada when it comes to emissions. Now, you've worked on scenarios for emission reductions in Canada. I think it's called Explorer of Pathways, to look at possible transformation pathways to achieve net zero in 2050. There's various approaches. So how can this actually be carried out in Canada? Can you explain that? In order to reach net zero in our models, first of all, we see that we have to decarbonize. society as much as possible. So there needs to be a great deal of electrification to cover our energy demand with clean electricity sources. Then we need to reduce gas and oil-related emissions in our analyses. We see that it's difficult to do that in a profitable way, so we have to reduce partly the production in the oil and gas sector. And then there's a question of carbon sequestration, capture and storage. We're at 150 million tonnes per year at the moment. So that's about 20% of the GHG emissions, 20 to 25% that needs to be captured and sequestered to compensate for these emissions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank all the witnesses for being here today. I did want to just start off to the witness who's from the Canadian Taxpayers Association. You thanked the Bloc, the NDP, and the Conservatives for their vote. I did want to note that while they don't have official party status, the Green Party also voted in favor for that exemption on drying fuels. But my questions are to Ms. Levin. And you mentioned last year, on average, oil and gas lobbyists were able to meet with the government 5 times a day. This year, from January to September, the Department of Environment and Climate Change met with these lobbyists 123 times. In our last committee meeting, the minister stated that this has little impact on regulations. But I have a difficult time believing that given all of the loopholes in the draft emissions cap regulations and the watering down of other policies, that these lobbying meetings aren't having an impact. Can you speak a little bit to this?
We can see the impact of fossil fuel lobbying, both in the fact that every single time the federal government has put forward any kind of climate policy, it's been attacked and then watered down by fossil fuel lobbyists. So there's a track record that clearly shows the influence that these meetings have. And of course, these lobbyists would not be spending hundreds of hours each year having meeting after meeting if they did not think it had an effect. If you meet with someone 5 times a day, you are going to be susceptible to their point of view. So there is clearly an influence of these lobbyists. It's also why they show up, fossil fuel lobbyists, executives show up in droves to international climate negotiations as well. They're there to weaken climate progress, just as they've been doing for the last 4 decades.
You. And can you talk a little bit about what you've seen when it comes to the kind of unfair burden, the loopholes provided to oil and gas producers? And in your opinion, do you think it's fair that companies, oil and gas companies, can apply for CCUS grants to grow oil and gas exploration?
So oil and gas companies, despite being some of the wealthiest companies operating in Canada, raking in massive profits, continue to be one of the most subsidized sectors of the economy. And that includes massive, massive subsidies for their techno fixes, carbon capture and storage, which has been around for 50 years, has a terrible track record, keeps getting downgraded by the IEA, and yet the federal government is putting tens of billions of dollars towards these technologies. In terms of the emissions cap on pollution from the oil and gas industry, a really important piece of Canada's climate plan, we saw that the design really did match what companies like in the Pathways Alliance have said they could achieve. And that is a very generous way to regulate an industry. Other industries are not regulated that way. Other industries are asked to go further than what they publicly say they can do anyways. And so we see that in these compliance flexibility options. Offsets and decarbonization fund are the 2 compliance flexibilities. Offsets means companies don't actually have to reduce their emissions. And every investigation that has occurred internationally into offsets has found that most of these are junk. Mostly they're unverified climate reductions, greenhouse gas reductions. It's very difficult to prove they're additional, that they're reliable, that they're durable. So this is the sector driving climate pollution in Canada. We need to hold these companies for reducing their emissions directly, not providing them escape mechanisms.
Mr.
And that's what these regulations do.
Mr. Leslie, for 3 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Drover, the Environment Commissioner audits revealed that the Trudeau government is not conducting value for money audits on various programs such as the Net Zero Accelerator Initiative. In some of these cases, massive corporations are being given millions of dollars in taxpayer money with no clear indication of whether or not there's any value for money nor what emissions will be reduced. So I'm curious your view on the fact that the Trudeau government is freely dispersing taxpayers' hard-earned money without any understanding of whether or not it has any purpose at all.
Thank you for the question. So there's a few things there to unpack. First is the fact that the only way the government will ever get the books balanced in this country is if we stop wasteful spending. And the most successful way that the government of the day in the 90s were able to get there was through significant reviews of every dollar spent. And we would like to see the federal government actually start to exercise that same level of cautions that their predecessors did and actually start doing serious audits of all government programming. And of course, it's not a good use of tax dollars, and it's not a good use of tax dollars when we see governments handing out cash to any business, regardless of the purpose. So, generally we're opposed to all forms of corporate welfare and think this government needs to stop handing cash out, especially unaudited, to big business.
Thank you. You may have heard in the last conversation we had, as well as the last meeting with Minister Guilbeault, when asked about a new international carbon tax on global shipping. What is your view as an organization on that?
Sorry,
a new carbon tax, a third one at a time everyone's suffering, to add carbon tax to everything we ship around the world and then send the money off to other countries.
No, we're absolutely opposed to all carbon taxes. And I mean, you say that there's just two carbon taxes. It's funny that you even build in the fact that the sales tax is then added on to the post carbon tax price on gasoline. So it's just an out of control tax on tax system that we've set up in this country that absolutely needs to be repealed.
It is ridiculous, and I will just let you, because you were not given the opportunity, comment on Bill C-234, a great piece of legislation that will help farmers despite the Liberals' opposition.
So my understanding is that the blockade right now that the Conservatives have brought in Parliament is for an accountability measure, and I think I think if the Liberals want to get serious about passing that bill, then they can follow through with the government accountability and then bring that legislation to the floor.
Can I have a point of clarification, Mr. Chair? Sure. I wanted to clarify, the member opposite asked a question about 3 carbon taxes. I don't know of any carbon taxes in Canada, so I didn't understand the witness's response. Could you please tell me what you're referring to, Mr. Leslie?
Well, no, I don't think that's on the format here.
Well, it's a clarification. I don't understand the question.
I don't think he really has to clarify, but I don't know what, that maybe...
Well,
maybe Mr. Ali can ask what about the clarification, because he's next.
Perhaps the witness should be the best response.
Well, okay, I stopped the time, but I'm going to start it up again. So I don't know, maybe Mr. Drover wants to answer that question.
A tax is a tax is a tax, no matter what you call it. So the carbon levy is absolutely a tax. It drives up the price of an item.
And what do you think will happen if, as the minister refused to have a clear answer on whether or not he will stop at $170 a ton in 2030, what do you think a continuing rise in carbon tax is going to do to the Canadians' livelihoods?
Well, think about my mother-in-law, again, in rural Newfoundland and Labrador. If her gasoline price continues to increase, then obviously it's going to have a devastating effect.
Thank you, Mr. Drover. We'll go now to Mr. Ali.
Thank you, Chair. I think it's my colleague Leah Taylor-Roy wants to have asked a few questions, so I think I'll share my time. Can you, Leah, you can go ahead, please.
Well, Ms. Taylor-Roy will take your time, yes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I'd like to ask that we table Section 36, Subdivision C, Section 36 of the Price on Pollution Act, so that we can clear up the confusion or the discrepancy about whether farm fuels are actually exempted or not. It's right in the legislation, so I think that would be useful to the conversation today, if that's acceptable.
Well, you could send it around. You could send it.
Everybody has access to the.
Okay, so you're making the point that the Section 36 of the bill, as it's come back to the House.
No, this is of the bill that's been passed on the price on pollution, talking about the carbon levy. And it's the section that exempts farm fuels.
Oh, yes, okay, I understand. Yeah,
the price on pollution. And there seemed to be some confusion with Mr. Mazier that they're actually not exempted.
Yes, I understand.
So I just wanted to ensure that that was actually in there. Okay, thank you. And on the other point I'd like to make, just to correct the record, is there is no carbon tax currently in Canada. There is a carbon levy under the Price on Pollution program that is in place. That has gone up consistently every year. It has not been quadrupled. And I do not understand what the other two carbon taxes are, so I would actually like to hear from the, at some point, what we're talking about in this.
For Mr. Drover, yes?
No, I have no questions for Mr. Drover. Except perhaps, Mr. Drover, you could tell me your background in economics and pricing climate policies.
Sure, I have a Bachelor of Science in Economics from Memorial University, and then I completed a law degree and a Master's in Business Administration with a focus in public policy.
And your experience in pricing climate programs?
Sorry, do you mean if I'm experienced in taxing Canadians on
No, I'm
gasoline?
asking for your experience in pricing climate programs. You gave your opinion on climate programs.
Yes,
I'm just wondering what your experience in pricing climate programs is.
My experience is representing Canadian taxpayers who are being hurt by this tax
Okay,
every
thank you.
time
So
they
we
go.
heard your anecdotal evidence from your mother. I'm just wondering if you had any broader experience to rely on when you were making those statements.
Point of order.
Sure, we can. We can use all your government's own data.
Point of order.
Sorry, I have a point of order from Mr. Mazur. I hope it's a point of order.
Well, it's just that we need to treat our witnesses with some respect here.
Yeah, that's as a general comment. I would agree. But sometimes it gets the exchanges get a little robust, and that seems to be normal for committees, at least our committee. Go ahead, Ms. Taylor-Roy. You have about 30 seconds.
Yeah, I meant no disrespect. I was simply trying to ascertain the basis on which the witness had presented his statement regarding the carbon levy and the Price on Pollution program. So no disrespect meant. I was just trying to understand where that perspective came from. So I'm not asking a question, but thank you anyway. Mr. Bigen, from the Climate Institute's perspective, if we were simply going to rely on technological innovation to reach our goals in 2030, would that be sufficient?
A quick yes or no, Mr. Bigen, please, because we're out of time.
It wouldn't be sufficient. Technology and innovation follow incentives from policy, so they are interconnected.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you.
Madame Posé pour 1 minute et demie.
1 minute et demie, monsieur.
1 minute 30, Mr. Musso. 90 seconds to explain to us, Mr. Musso, all of this. Let's compare this at a planetary scale with other countries, whereas Canada, located Jim Watch, said they were 62 out of 67. But drawing on your experience and knowledge, what do you think Canada's position is on the international stage? If we look in terms of the G7, Canada is lagging behind in terms of reductions compared to 2005 or 1999, which is normally the level taken for reductions. Now, partially that's because it's taken a long time to put forward. Programs are starting to kick in and take effect, but we still don't have the necessary skill to meet our targets. So we really need to redouble our efforts, and we need to have some consistency and stability in how we deploy these measures, and the different levels of governments at different scales have to play their correct roles. At a federal level, there's an important role to play in terms of regulations where we need to make progress. We've got a price, we've got a carbon market set up, but these tools have to be further beefed up, and they need to be made more specific, in particular for the industrial market, in order to attain our targets. And we need real strategies, sector by sector, that need to be clear, and they need to be deployed with specific objectives. That's something that's still missing in Canada. Thank you, Ms. Collins.
A minute and a half.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to take this opportunity to table a motion, not to move it, but just to table it. The motion reads, and it's been sent to the clerk in both official languages as well. Given that, A, the Environment Commissioner reported that the government is not on track to meet their 2030 emissions reductions targets. B, the testimony heard by the committee from witnesses in the meetings which took place on November 20th, November 27th, and December 2nd included concern with the government's emissions reductions policies and progress. The committee report to the House of Commons its disappointment regarding the government's slow progress in meeting 2030 emissions reductions targets. And with the very small remaining time, I'd just like to give it to Ms. Levin just to talk about the fact that our oil and gas exports and the emissions from those exports have risen 58% since 2012.
You have 30 seconds, Ms. Levin.
Thanks for the question. So under our current legal framework, countries are only accountable for the domestic emissions, but there's precedent in Canada in recognizing that what we export has consequences, and we've taken action in areas like asbestos, exporting thermal coal. There's a recognition that our exports have global impacts. Last year, the emissions that come from the oil and gas and coal that we export reached 1 billion tons, far surpassing our domestic emissions. It is incumbent on all major oil and gas exporters to think about their responsibility
globally. Thank you very much. Mr. Deltel, pour 3 minutes.
And a point of order, Mr. Chair.
Yes.
Just not for this moment, but maybe to get back to the committee. In the past, we've had conversations about when you table a motion, whether or not that takes away from your time of questioning.
I didn't take it away from you. I mean, you took your time. Either there's two things we could do. I could say, after you've tabled it, your time is gone. Or I can say it's part of your minute and a half. And that's what I said, because we didn't start a debate or anything.
And I guess maybe if you could just check with the clerk and come back to committee at a later date, because I don't want to take any more time with this, but just if there is any precedence for once a motion is tabled to have that as separate time and then keep your remaining time. But
there's no.
You've told us that. It's your discretion.
Apparently, it's basically at the discretion of the chair. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much for the clarification.
My rule of thumb is if you're just tabling the motion, it's you can continue until your time is up. If you're moving a motion and you're starting a debate, then you lose your time, whatever was left. So we'll go to Mr. Deltel for 3 minutes, please.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Bonjour.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome to the witnesses for this portion of our committee meeting. Mr. Mousseau, I'd like to have a conversation with you. First of all, welcome. We have met face-to-face in the past, and it's good to see you here virtually and all the comments that you may make. Now, Mr. Mousseau, of course, we're talking about oil, we're talking about fossil fuels, and we also know that this current government has taken everyone by surprise. 6 years ago, there was a project that was underway, the Trans Mountain Pipeline, and all of a sudden, the federal Liberal government decided to buy it at $4.7 billion. That was the price tag, and decided to carry out the necessary work required. At the end of the day, just for the works alone, it cost ×6 the original price tag. So if we look at all of the amounts, it's almost 40 billion, 38.7 billion that taxpayers have in fact invested in a pipeline. I don't have anything against pipelines. As long as we need them, then I prefer to have Canadian oil flowing through them rather than foreign oil. But from an economic point of view, was that a good idea? Or do you have examples in the world where a country has decided to buy a pipeline and pay for it through taxpayers? And how much time will it take for that to be rendered profitable for taxpayers? Well, I have not carried out any analysis on this pipeline. However, in a context of decarbonisation, we can imagine that this money could have been used instead to support decarbonisation efforts so that Canada could quickly attain its targets. So it is rather surprising when government is finger-wagging and talking about decarbonisation and vaunting itself as a world leader in decarbonisation, but nevertheless, they're spending almost 40 billion of taxpayers' money on a pipeline. Now, a last question for you, Mr. Mousseau. Earlier, you touched upon the fact that Canada is the worst performer within G7 and 62 out of 67 countries, as shown at COP29, with the report that has been submitted and comes out, in fact, on an annual basis. So I have a question. There are states in the US that have a carbon pricing policy, but the US as such does not have one. Now, Barack Obama and President Biden are big defenders of decarbonisation, but they didn't take a carbon pricing approach. So how come Canada, which now has carbon pricing throughout Canada, how come we're in a worse position than US that does not have carbon pricing across all states? There are two reasons. First of all, there's a question of consistency at a federal level, because it's very difficult to get projects to move ahead at a federal level with all of the different parties that have got extremely divergent views when it comes to even the objective of decarbonisation. And unlike the US states, some of them have made enormous efforts already in terms of decarbonisation, whereas here in the provinces we're seeing stagnation. Apart from decarbonisation of electricity generation, we've actually shut down the coal-powered stations. Thank you, and we'll finish off with Mr. Van Koeverden.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question will be for Mr. Begen. Sorry, I've heard your name pronounced a number of different ways today, and as somebody with a difficult last name to pronounce, I solidarity with my friends with difficult last names. But, sir, I've heard a couple of different questions relating to performance, and I've seen the graphs relating to how much various sectors have decarbonized in Canada, and I imagine you have too. Can you point to if there is only one sector in Canada that is still continuing to increase emissions rather than decrease emissions, as most sectors are?
The sector that has grown most since 2005 in terms of emissions is the oil and gas sector. The building sector has also grown. Other sectors are either mostly flat or have made progress in reducing emissions.
Do you think that Canada's performance, as it has been described, requires the efforts of industry and these energy sectors to participate and to more actively decarbonize? And secondly, do you think that Canada, as a country, has a chance at achieving our objectives, our climate commitments, without regulations to ensure that the energy sector participates?
Deliver on interim targets in 2030, or especially in terms of long-term targets of net zero by 2050, all sectors are going to have to contribute. All sectors are going to have to reduce their emissions, and that's going to require policy that touches every part of the emissions inventory and creates incentives for emissions reductions all across the economy. That includes the oil and gas sector. It includes industrial sector. It is again, relevant that there are interactions across multiple policies. Multiple policies work together to reduce those emissions. In the oil and gas sector, for example, there are incentives in forms of investment tax credits. There is the industrial carbon price that creates incentives in those sectors, as well as the forthcoming oil and gas sector. So how those things fit together matter.
Thank you. Your analysis has shown the importance of industrial carbon pricing in getting to net zero, as you just stated. Some industry leaders, including the Pathways Alliance, which is a consortium of energy companies, have recently stated that the leader of the Conservative Party's intention to end industrial carbon pricing is already creating uncertainty and holding back massive investments in decarbonization. We've also seen that in Alberta. Can you speak to why this uncertainty and how a political position on industrial carbon pricing is already hurting our decarbonization efforts across our economy?
The future of policy signals matter for mobilizing big investments for these big industries. The investments in technologies to reduce emissions are long-lived, and that means expected future carbon prices and expected future incentives from policy matter as much almost as current incentives. So there is costs of uncertainty regarding the existence of policy. There are costs of the robustness of uncertainty in the robustness of those systems. It's why there's a live conversation and some current policy work around an instrument called Carbon Contracts for Difference to try to mobilize some of those incentives through certainty.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the witnesses for a robust but interesting. Sometimes the more robust the conversation, the more interesting it is. And so I want to thank everyone for being here and also for Mr. Mousseau for being part of the discussion. We'll stop here, and on Wednesday we'll start up with the Net Zero Accelerator. I should mention that the documents that have been that people have been, members have been, and their staff have been able to consult are still available to consult, but in a different room. They're now available to consult in the clerk's office, whereas before they were in a dedicated room, but that dedicated room is apparently under some kind of renovation. So we've shifted the location, but they're still available. Thank you very much. Have a good day.